Should we
This
have a lip
conference
syncing
will now
contest?
be recorded.
Thank you for joining the City of Kingston's Common Council at our Housing Special Housing Committee. Today is Wednesday, April 29th. My name is Andrea Schott, the Council President and organizer for our virtual meetings. Before we begin our meeting, we would like to go over a few meeting guidelines to help us navigate the system as efficiently and respectfully as possible. We ask that members of the public and press remain muted and off camera for the length of the meeting. As organizer, I reserve the right to mute anyone who unmutes themselves. Council members and city staff will control their own mute button. Good practice would be to mute yourself if you are not speaking to avoid background noise and feedback. If a council member or staff wishes to speak or guest, they will raise their hands. The chairperson will call on them before they speak by stating their name clearly for our audio listeners. All of our meetings are recorded. Both video and written transcriptions will be made available to the public on the city's website the following day. Although we will not have public speaking tonight, you could submit written comments to the City of Kingston Clerk Elisa Tinty at emtinty@kingston-ny.gov or by dropping them off at the drop box located outside the side door of City Hall. We also encourage you to reach out to committee chairs or your ward's representative at any time. If you have any audio issues, send a text message to the following number, 845-594-6120. I'll repeat this number again, but be aware that phone calls will not be answered during the meeting. The number to text is 845-594-6120. As the organizer for today's meeting, I reserve the right to lock and pause the meeting to eject anyone who has behaved inappropriately. Lastly, at tonight's meeting, we have in attendance Chair Alderman Scott Childress, special committee members Alderman Don Tollerman, Alderwoman Michelle Hirsch, non-committee member Alderman Jeffrey Ventura Morel. Thank you for your patience during these difficult times, and on behalf of the Common Council, I wish you and your family good health. I now turn the floor over to Chair Scott Childress.
Thank you very much, Andrea. This is Rennie Scott Childress. I would just like to remind everyone, I know it's a little weird, but when you start to speak, please say your name because a lot of people can only listen. They're not actually seeing our images. So it's very helpful if we repeat our names. I'll try to introduce everyone, or if one of the other members of the committee subcommittee is asking a question, please try to use the person's name that you're directing the question to so we can make sure that everyone knows who's speaking at any particular time. Thank you everyone for coming tonight. This subcommittee on housing is purely informational. We don't have any actual power to pass legislation or vet legislation. Our job here is to get information to help the members of the Common Council when issues of legislation do come before them so that we can try to get as much background as possible to provide for informed decisions. That said, we have two guests tonight, and I was thinking that we would start the first 20 to 30 minutes of this 1 hour meeting would be dedicated to talking to the two of them. And then the last 30 minutes will be dedicated mostly to talking about a couple of initiatives that we'd like to undertake, as well as other possible initiatives that we might need to do some research on. So our two guests tonight are Kevin O'Connor and Scott Lanzarone, or Lanzarone. Sorry, is it okay if I just call you Scott, since I don't know how to pronounce the Italian last name there? I'm afraid we're not hearing you, Scott. Uh-oh. I don't know if we can get Scott in. We'll start with Kevin O'Connor then, if that's okay, while we try to get Scott online. So Kevin O'Connor is the, is it executive director? Is that the proper term of RUPCO?
Yeah, it's good enough. CEO, absolutely.
Okay, the leader in chief. And RUPCO has done a lot of work in and around Kingston, Ulster County, even further, in terms of providing housing for lots of different folks in the area. And we're excited to have him here tonight because of his expertise and his long experience in dealing with housing issues. So one of the things that we're particularly concerned with, of course, is what is going to happen as tenants may be unable to pay their rent. What happens if people lose their housing? We were already in a difficult housing position before the current crisis began. We knew that there was a lot of difficulty for people at the low end of the economic spectrum finding quality housing. So I would like to just open it up for a minute or two to you, Kevin. If you can give us a little background, tell us what's concerning you in the present moment.
Well, thank you, Rennie. Good evening to members of the council, and glad to join you, Scott, on this call, and to have members of the audience. Obviously, strange and unbelievable times. I hope everyone is doing well, personally, and your family and friends and colleagues. Unfortunately, I think too many of us know folks that are really being affected here by this pandemic. Housing is something that we at RUPCO love to talk about. That we've, generally I've been at this for 30 some odd years, and in general, we've had a form of a housing crisis throughout my career. And a pandemic like this is really exacerbating the situation. Housing is a broad continuum, as I like to say. We're all on it, you and me, and everyone on this call, and all the city residents. This pandemic is going to affect homeowners. It's going to affect renters. It's going to affect people who are homeless, people who need supportive housing. And no one has any magic wands. We're particularly concerned right now about what's going on with folks who have lost income, whether they're homeowners or renters, and how we keep the model of affordable housing. We've been working very hard to promote affordable housing here and throughout the Hudson Valley. We've over time have had some inroads. We can't afford to lose any affordable housing because of the pandemic. So, I mean, we have to, when people don't have income, the system, the model breaks down, and people need money for not only their housing, but for food, and now maybe for some medical costs and transportation, and so maybe not so much transportation. I guess one of the jokes I heard is we're all getting 3 months to the gallon now. But the costs of life are significant, and so I think, in terms of housing and the rental model, we can talk about the home ownership model as well, but we need to start with income replacement. So we've had one stimulus check from the government that's allegedly getting out to people. There might well need to be additional stimulus checks from the federal government to people. We have unemployment, which on the one hand can be more generous sometimes than people's prior pay. But on the other hand, of course, the unemployment system seems to be completely bogged down, and many people aren't getting through, and many people haven't received any money yet at all. But at some point, getting income replacement so that people can continue to pay for food and all the costs and pay for their housing. Secondly, we're looking for more rental assistance. We have been a provider of rental assistance for decades, and we think that rental assistance is a very efficient model when we're trying to create affordable housing. And we need more federal rental assistance, and we're hoping that the next stimulus bill will have a significant chunk of rental assistance. And I think that that's the second strategy, to preserve the model of housing. Thirdly, then, if those two, if we get past those two and it's still not working, we have to look to, I think, help owners and landlords to mitigate their costs. we own housing. We have to pay, we pay taxes. We're paying for insurance. We're paying for our maintenance staff and cleaning staff to go out and clean the units. So we have people on staff that are being paid. So we need to perhaps look at ways to mitigate the costs, perhaps defer some of our debt. We generally have debt on all of our properties. Most owners and landlords have debt. But in some way preserve the housing model that we currently have. And that's just in the renter realm. There's the homeowner realm. I think there's things that can be done there as well. And there's, the other two parts of the continuum that I like to address would be homelessness and supportive housing. But I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you very much, Kevin. I'm wondering, Michelle or Don, do you have questions for Kevin?
No, Michelle Hirsch here. I'm very familiar with REPCO's work and the enormous job they do helping support our community with the housing that they build and the vouchers and support that they give the community so that they can choose their apartments. And I hope that we have continued growth in this area for people because they're really going to need it. And I thank you for coming in tonight, Kevin.
Yeah, good to see you back with us, Michelle.
Thank you.
Don Tollerman?
Kevin, there's the CARE Act. There may be money available to help us in the short term, and Rennie was sort of reaching out to all of us to say, hey, is there any, if we got some money, how could we use it to alleviate some short-term needs in affordable housing? And thought you might have some ideas.
Yeah, well, I think you might have heard me say that I think rental assistance is both needed and efficient. We have just recently agreed, I think, with Ulster County. We had $200,000 of a remaining CDBG grant that we were using for housing rehab, for owner-occupied, low-income owner-occupied to do some rehab. We're going to pivot that money to a rental assistance program and provide short-term rental assistance with it. It's only a couple $100,000. The city of Kingston has an allocation of 440 CDBG dollars. We're going to come in with a small, it could be a multiple. We're going to come in with a rental assistance program because the county CDBG money can't go to city residents. And so maybe the city wants to use some of its money. And, we could do in multiples. If we want to do 75,000 or 150 or more, the city can make some decisions about that. There's probably certainly competing needs in the realm of food and housing and what have you, but rental assistance, affordable housing for us to build, whether you're building, very plain vanilla housing on a green field, and spending 200,000, or sometimes, we spend north of 300,000 on, historic rehabs. It's very expensive. Rental assistance, providing $500, $600, $700, $800, $900 a month of rental assistance to bridge a gap between a market rent and someone paying 30%, costs about $6,000, $7,000, $8,000 a year for a full rental assistance program. But in the short term, to provide a couple of months, 2-3 months worth of rental assistance, we think is one of the best first steps that can be used here to help people.
That's great, thank you. So, Randy, let's move over to Scott and address some of the. I guess you can introduce it, but to give the landlord's perspective, local Kingston landlord typically owns smaller multifamily units. Go ahead, Randy. Why don't you take it from there?
Sure, Randy Scott Childress again. Scott, again, I apologize if I butchered your last name. Maybe you can help us say it correctly. And then if you would let us know what kind of housing it is that you provide in Kingston and what kind of concerns you have in the present moment.
Yeah, sure. Can everyone hear me all right? And
yes.
Okay, great. And Alderman Childress, you did a pretty good job on my last name, so thank you. Actually, I prepared a couple of talking points. Wasn't really quite sure where we were going to go in this discussion, but first of all, help all of you and yours are safe during this unprecedented time. And Alderwoman Hirsch, I hope you're convalescing well. I've read in the paper that you actually contracted the virus. Good to see you, Kevin. We're proud to be housing a Repco tenant. And thank you for the opportunity to speak here tonight. I was asked to, and at first I declined, frankly. Other housing providers like myself are kind of hesitant to get into the public fray because of all the vitriol of late. And frankly, to put it bluntly, we just don't really want a brick through one of our windows. But I watched the last meeting and heard it was important to provide another viewpoint rather than the same view and have a constant echo chamber. So I figured if it wasn't me, who, and if not now, when? And for the record, my pronouns are he and him, and I identify as a housing provider. The term landlord in today's day and age is pejorative and old hat and outdated. So dates back to the time of the feudal system and serfdom. So housing provider is more appropriate in this time. I want to thank you for the efforts you made to this point. We appreciate the support of the bills in Albany, specifically Senator Kavanaugh's calling for rent vouchers for affected residents. We also appreciate the letter that the mayor wrote to Governor Cuomo asking for a 21-day extension with regard to paying property taxes without interest or penalty. Furthermore, we're also sympathetic to the mayor's language in his letter that we feel like we got to do something to give some relief, right? But to reiterate what Mr. Peavy said in his letter, likely the most pragmatic thing to do is to wait for guidance from Albany. I know June on the calendar looks like it's right around the corner, but in terms of the pandemic, it's really an eternity. And people want guidance and certainty during this uncertain time. But Governor Cuomo, I think we can all admit, has been doing a pretty good job of being data dependent. And I don't even think he knows what the outcome of all of this will be. I think in his heart of hearts, he believed that the moratorium was all that was needed because he believed that the unemployment and stimulus checks would kick in long before the moratorium was lifted. And fortunately, for our residents who are out of work, that in fact is the case. I prepared something about the last meeting and to Ms. Gerard's proposal. We did some research on it and spoke to some legal sources. I believe it's kind of a moot point, and that Kingston does not have the unilateral authority or the jurisdictional authority to pass the resolution. What Ms. Gerard is really looking to do is generate some momentum out of thin air for her cause by naming names of other municipalities she's visited to make the cause appear legitimate. And based on some of the questions that you raised, I think you got the idea that no other city had adopted the resolution yet because they too realize they don't have the authority. She's looking for a legal guinea pig of a city to take the bait. And so when all of this gets to Albany, it can appear that it's a done deal when that may not be the case. Mm-hmm. Smart move. I understand what she's doing, but that is that. Further, she said in her proposal that it doesn't decrease the debt owed to the landlord. But I need to point something out here. We're not banks. We don't have unlimited funds. We're not bottomless pits. And certainly we're not watching the money roll in, wearing our top hats and adjusting our monocles. Where are we financially? We're very fortunate. We have been paid in April, and the checks for May just arrived. So it does look like we are going to be paid for May as well. But I just need to point out, our expenses are likely going to be pretty high. It occurred to me when I was writing the check for the most recent water bill that although this one is pretty manageable, The next one is likely to be pretty big, as naturally people are home nearly 24/7. All the things that go with it. There's more flushing the toilets, more taking showers, people are cooking more wear and tear, more of everything, really. More heating, more utilities. I just replaced the heating element for one of my tenants in her stove because she's cooking at home more, and she has that right. And we're happy to provide it for her. And my dad and I, we're a father-son operation, and we're fortunate to do a lot of the work ourselves. But for other housing providers, they rely on plumbers, electricians, exterminators who are working relentlessly around the clock, and God bless them. But they need to be paid as well. If we don't receive the revenues that we need, and fortunately we have by the natural way of rent, we have to choose to pay one or the other, or taxes, or certainly not all. But fortunately, we're not at that point. There's a constant question that keeps coming up, right? And that is, you hear a lot of activists say that housing is a human right, housing is essential, and you see some people have the Facebook frame that housing equals healthcare. Let me just point out, we are really proud and willing and able to provide housing during this uncertain time. It's where all of us are right now, right? Likely, it's where we're all supposed to be. And we just want to be compensated just like everyone else. We're all in this together, and we need to get the finances we need to provide safe housing to our residents, and so we can meet our obligations. That's really it. If it were any other essential good or service, like food, for instance, we wouldn't be telling ShopRite or Walmart or Hannaford, all of which are multi-million dollar businesses, to simply let people take things off their shelves without paying. No, of course, we would allocate the funds, buy the food, and distribute it as needed. With healthcare, we're not going to drag people into the hospital, force them to work, and then tell them they're not getting paid. No, again, we would allocate the funds so they have what they need. Somehow with housing, municipalities kind of get the idea that they can leave housing providers holding the bag. And I'm here to tell you, you can't. we just want to get paid like everyone else. Not that crazy of an idea. So let's find a way to make sure we could get funding so we could provide safe housing for our residents and meet our obligations. And just to point out, I'm glad Kevin is here. Imagine for a second that RUPCO's operating finances suddenly dried up, or the Kingston Housing Authority's operating fund suddenly dried up. It'd be a disaster. So we need you to have the same fire in your belly for our residents as you would theirs, because they matter to us, and we're stewards of their safety, and we view ourselves as their advocates during this time. On another point, I spoke to another number of housing providers on this topic, and we understand why the 90-day moratorium is in place. We do. And nobody is really looking to evict right now, whether the moratorium is in effect or not. It doesn't really make sense. Frankly, it's bad for business. For one, it's expensive. Two, it takes a long time. And three, why do you use an eviction? You use an eviction as a last-ditch effort to get paid. But you do so by getting the unit back so you can rent it to someone new who will pay you. But honestly, no one's moving right now. We're at the middle of a pandemic, so it just doesn't make sense. All of the providers I spoke to, that one had a tenant that wasn't able to pay the full rent. Shout out to Pasquale Lavinio. And he said, as I think all of us would, we're willing to work with them. We're human too. We understand. Nobody's looking to put anyone out on the street. All right. So one solution, we were talking about, what possibly can we do? It's just a thought. And I'm not sure if we can have the authority to do it, but let's at least explore it. Ask any housing provider's largest expense, what could actually move the needle? Property taxes. So I'm pragmatic here. I'm not calling for the full-on cancellation of property taxes. city does have to operate, but some relief certainly probably could be provided. And when it comes to New York City and to all the residents who are listening, if you're unable to pay your rent this month, I want you to think that you're able, at least my residents at least, that they'd be able to reach out to me and let me know that they're having a problem. You probably don't need to organize a rent strike. That's the nuclear option, and has a lot of consequences. And there are going to be mass casualties on both sides, mass casualties. And unfortunately, the largest loser in all of this is likely to be you. It's unfortunate as it is, but again, we are all in this together, and together we'll get through this. And Alderman Childress, I hope that at least answers some of the questions.
Great, I appreciate that. And there's definitely a lot there for us to talk about more in terms of in the future. There's a lot of issues precisely of, delivering services, really understanding what housing providers do and the issues that you face. And since we are solely an information gathering group here, that'll be our goal, and I hope we can talk to you some more in the future. I see that Alderwoman Hirsch has a question, I guess, for Scott, Michelle?
Yes, thank you,
Okay.
Alderman Alderwoman Michelle Hirsch here. Thank you for coming on, Scott. I appreciate your perspective, especially as a housing provider, advocating for tenants to go to their landlords and work with them, work things out with them, work out issues. That is always my first go-to advice for any sort of issue. But I want to say that the legislation that I did introduce that you were referring to is being looked at. We're not necessarily looking at that. I realized in my research that the federal housing funding, any federal housing funding for landlords actually has a moratorium, an eviction moratorium of 120 days. So it actually wouldn't be good practice or legal for the city of Kingston to adopt a 30-day additional moratorium in the city of Kingston, because then we're still in conflict with the federal housing eviction moratorium of July 25th. So we're sort of looking at different avenues. But and I also appreciate that we want to begin helping the tenants as sooner than later, and not keep creating more of a balloon payment for them in the end. So as with any legislation, it's a work in progress, and I appreciate your coming on tonight and discussing your point.
Yeah,
Great.
Thanks.
Don, do you have any questions? No, you're good? Okay. Well, we're at the end of our first half hour here. So Kevin, do you have anything else you want to add here?
No,
Kevin
I'm good.
O'Connor?
I think I'm good. I appreciate it. I appreciate, love the term housing provider. I'm going to use that, Scott. Look, I'm a fairly progressive guy. I do believe in trying to get to housing as a human right. I do believe housing is healthcare. I mean, during a pandemic, we've been advised to stay in our homes, and for some of us, that's been pretty comfortable, and for some of us, not so much. But we have a model currently, and it's an economic model, and we have providers and tenants, and as I've said to people, there are some really outstanding landlords, or excuse me, housing providers. There are, people who are a little more middle of the road, and some folks who are in the business probably shouldn't be in the business. And then similarly, you talk to people who have been a housing provider, and renters are a mixed breed as well. People who really understand, are very good tenants, and others who are more middle of the road, and then some folks who can be problematic. And so how do we all come together? We have this current model. I think having advocated for my entire career for more of this affordable housing, I want to make sure that we somehow keep the model, keep the housing we have and continue to find ways to build more of it. So it is an economic model, and that's why I'm looking for. The other thing is, the last thing I'll say is this, that we obviously are all facing tremendous budget deficits at the county and state level. We're seeing layoffs. Sullivan County laid off a slew of people already. It's coming. And there's going to be such shrinking resource. So how, from a strategic point of view, do we best preserve and not waste money or be redundant with this source of money? But and I think the strategy, again, around income replacement, trying to find, if people have their income replaced, then they can continue to pay rent. If they're not, if we can find them rental assistance. If we can't do that, we have to find money or resource or mechanisms. You mentioned tax abatements, there's debt deferment. We carry a lot of debt on our properties. That might be a tool for homeowners, forbearance or debt deferment for a few months. We have to find ways to preserve the models that we currently have, move forward, and hopefully, I'm hopeful that one of the silver linings will be that this has focused people's attention. I think more people understand when you don't have enough income to afford your house, it's a real problem. And we hope that more will support us in trying to create more affordable housing moving forward. So thank you very much.
Good. Thank you very much, Kevin and Scott. And I hope we'll be able to talk to you all again in the future. I'm sure we'll be leaning on you for lots of different kinds of information as we think through. So, you know, when we think about housing providers here in Kingston, we have lots of different levels, kind of building on what Kevin just said. And we want to think of ways to preserve the housing that we currently have, but potentially invite other housing providers into the market. So some of those things would have to do, we can investigate perhaps different kinds of tax credits, other possible ways of helping families that have a room they might want to convert or a garage or something like that. To provide more housing. We're trying to be as creative as possible in this crisis and think about how any solution we take to deal with the crisis, how can we also try to make sure that that's something that will help us in the long term as well. So again, thanks to both of you, and we appreciate your being here. Feel free to stay and listen to more, but we need to move on now to the next part of the program here. All right, so Rennie Scott Childress here still. Michelle, you and I were talking about some possible programs here the other day, so I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the idea of creating an amendment to the landlord registry, the home housing provider registry, that would make people aware of the federal requirements here in the moment.
Right, so this, what I sort of brought up before when Scott was on, the city of Kingston actually has 2 eviction moratorium dates. One is for mortgage holders, landlords, housing providers that have private bank mortgages. And that is an eviction date of June 20th. The moratorium for the eviction date is June 20th. If someone has a federally funded mortgage, say Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, or the part of the Kingston Housing Authority, for example, they're governed by federal law, and their eviction date would be July, their moratorium for evictions would be until July 25th. So it would actually extend 1 month and 5 days past the New York State eviction moratorium. So we're dealing with actually a very, very confusing issue. And since Ms. Gerard was on last week, I dug in further, as I said I was, to do more research. And I was trying to determine how many landlords in the city of Kingston would actually be affected by the federal housing eviction, the moratorium. And we actually don't know. We have a landlord registration law, and we have landlords that register their properties with us. but we don't know if they're guided, if their mortgages come under federal mortgages or they have private banking. And so we don't know which moratorium will even apply to them. And so looking into ways that we can figure that out so that we can educate the various housing providers, landlords in the city of Kingston, and have them also provide the most accurate information to their tenants. And so filings for evictions at this time in the state of New York can begin on May 15th. So I would like to, I was looking to amend the legislation that, you know, I had previously submitted with ideas around how we can educate landlords as to the most appropriate moratorium that applies to them and help in the system, in the court system.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. Don, something you want to say? Don Tollerman?
Hi, guys, it's Don Tollerman. Michelle, that I get it, but it seems like a lot of work to identify who those mortgage holders are. It's private information. So like you say, we'd have to change the law, do a mailing. And we're only talking about 1 month and 5 days additional. I'm not sure that it's worth, it's a big effort to get that information.
Well, it would be possible because the building safety has the landlord registration and all their, most of them are email address. Most of them have email addresses. So this is something that could go out probably pretty quickly via email. And the idea would be to, as much, I'm sure a lot of landlords, a lot of housing providers don't realize that this federal requirement is there for them as well. And, you know, it also raises issues. So if a tenant is in one of these particular properties and is facing eviction for some reason, he or she or they might not know that they have this other protection. So that would be one of the crucial things. I don't know that it would take a lot of time, but you know, if we wanted to try to address this soon, we could easily find out from building safety the amount of time it would take them to put this together, and you know, what would be required in terms of specific legislation to require this little bit of information. So.
I mean, even still, we're going to end up with a percentage of owners who used federal financing. We're just talking about a very small universe, I think, of landlords that this would apply to. But, you know, I don't object in principle. I just object in practice. It just seems like a lot. You say it's not a lot. It's just an email. You know, things are seldom that simple. You know, there's follow-up. The landlord will be, well, why are they asking? Why do I need to tell them, you know, who my lender is, you know, all that stuff.
Well, yeah, I mean, they wouldn't have to be specific, but it would be if it were, it's if it's a FHA or similar type of federal loan that's backing up their actual loan. Michelle Hirsch.
I think that it is very valid and timely thing for us to do as City of Kingston and the council, because we've had a huge housing crisis prior to this pandemic. We have a lot of conflicting information coming in from the state level and the federal level for our tenants. And this is actually an opportunity to provide education to the tenants and to the landlords. And I think it sends a really strong message to the community that we are here, that we're hearing them, that we're listening to them, that we care, that we don't want people to feel like they're just going to be out on the street.
Okay,
And
I get that, but the other side to that coin is it also sends a strong message to the developers that we are, you know, not a friendly place to develop. You know, I prefer the carrot. I want to focus our energies on, you know, identifying pieces of land that can be developed, bring developers in, and build some housing. You know, and I don't want to I want to be as friendly and forward thinking as we can to attract new housing.
Great. I don't think these things are mutually exclusive, or these two different directions are mutually exclusive. In terms of the federal housing requirements here, this is information. You know, it's important information for people to have, and so I think the other thing to do would be, though, we can think of caveats, we can think of potential problems, such as how long would it take building safety to get this out. So if we can find that information quickly, you know, early tomorrow, for example, then that would help us understand how quickly we could move on something like this and how beneficial it might be. Michelle, did you have something to add?
I just wanted to say that we're in the middle of, I just want to reiterate, we're in the middle of a crisis, and we're looking at, you know, a year ago, this time of year, between April 1st and June 1st, 2019, we had 740 people in Ulster County that were in shelter and facing homelessness. I don't have the updated number for this time this year. It's not out yet by the federal government, but that's a huge number. And we're looking at a real homeless crisis and people potentially being out of their homes. We've County Executive Pat Ryan had to create a hotline because tenants at this current time are being harassed and getting illegal lockouts. Illegal lockouts were actually happening in my ward, in Ward 9, prior to the COVID pandemic. And I just think that, yes, we want developers to come build, but we also don't want predatory landlords preying on people that don't have the correct information. And we need to help people get the correct information and keep our community stably housed, because in the long run, it's going to cost everyone a lot more. And it's just the humane and the right thing to do.
Right. So good. Well, I think this is an important thing for us to consider. I'm confident that building safety could get something out within a week or two. And as long as we frame it in terms of information, providing information to all the different parties, I think that's an important thing. And that's one of, you know, within the limitations that we have as a council, that's one of the things we can definitely do. Alderman Morel, do you have something to say?
Hi, Jeffrey Ventura Morel here. I just have a logistical question about this amendment of the landlord registry that you're speaking about. Would this be presented as an amendment to the proposal that was presented before? Would this have to be a new communication that you would send?
I'm looking to have it as amendment, like to be amended, for it to go to laws and rules and to be an amendment.
Right. Well, I mean, I'm not sure the exact procedure, but I would think too, if we did have a special laws and rules meeting before caucus on Monday, that we could suspend the rules and introduce it then, whether it's, you know, on its own. We would need to check in with that and make sure with the council president and our resident Robert's Rules of Order maven. So let's talk about that. We can talk about the potential for doing a special laws and rules at the end of this meeting. The second thing, though, I want to get out, we've got about 15, 20 minutes left in our meeting, is Michelle, you were talking about the potential for creating a fund that we could use in tandem with Housing Court that would have funds available. So this would be different from the kind of money that Kevin O'Connor was talking about for rental assistance. This would be more specifically for people who find themselves in Housing Court because of losing income due to the COVID crisis. Can you say a bit more?
Yes, thank you, Ryan. It's Alderwoman Hirsch again. So my original proposal that I had submitted as a communication had the ability for tenants to be granted a stay up to 180 days or 6 months through housing court. But actually, in further research, found out that real property law number 735 used to only be applied to New York City, and now applies to Kingston as well. So Kingston residents have the ability to go to housing court if there is an eviction notice. If the landlord tries to evict them, they can go to housing court and they have the right to get a stay up to 1 year as long as they are current with their rent. The real property law also says that there's supposed to be an escrow account that the tenant would be paying into, so that then that money would then go to the landlord so that the landlord knows that the tenant is current. So we don't have that sort of account currently here in the city of Kingston or with the city court, housing court. So I thought it might be a good idea if there's a way to create the escrow account so that we create the language for the 360 days, stay on evictions, provided that they're keeping current. I mean, that of course is obviously up to the city court judge to grant the stay on eviction. But if there is a way to create the escrow account and then for some grant money to go into the escrow account to help offset the back rents that could possibly owed and help keep current on rents.
Great. Just one little thing. I think you mean real property action law 753, not 735.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Don't want people looking it up and saying, what is this? I think that's a great idea for us to explore further. This is the sort of thing where, we wouldn't necessarily need to fund it right away. We might be able to look at a way to put it into the budget as a protection for tenants, a kind of protection of last resort. Because I don't know if we would be able to or want to put specific emergency money into that. But I think it's a great idea for us to explore further. Don wants to say something, then back to you, Michelle, okay?
Okay.
Yeah, so that idea, it doesn't, to me, it's having first of all, the courts are the courts are closed, and they're going to be digging out for potentially years of a backlog. I don't even know how evictions, how long it will take for a judge to see an eviction case. And the idea of the government handling an escrow account, to me, is just a disaster. I don't think that the government will be able to keep up with that at all. So I get the idea of the grant to help seed it. That's a nice idea, but you also have to consider that we're going to have a huge chunk of our revenues taken, and we're going to be making decisions about who to fire, what program to cut. So, it'll be very competitive where any of our grant money goes to. So I don't like that idea because I don't like the idea of an escrow account that is managed, that involves the government. It just doesn't seem, I don't think that can be pulled off.
Well, one thing is we can run it on the model of the first-time homebuyer program under community development. So there are models for it, but in terms of how much money we're talking about, of course, that's all stuff to be talked about in the future. But I think this is definitely something for us to kick around some. Michelle?
Yeah, well, first I just would like to say that the idea of the account, the holding account, is part of the law. So there is supposed to be something that tenants are paying into if they are paying off for a stay on an eviction. And I'm not necessarily looking for the city of Kingston to fund it out of their funds. It's if we are eligible for future emergency service grants that are for the purpose of staving off homelessness, that's money that could then potentially be used. If it's possible, I don't know, I'm not a lawyer, obviously, but if we can, if the public can contribute to the fund, just as we have Radio Kingston created the fund that people are accessing, is there a way for people to contribute money to a fund even if it's a second of fund, if it's not the main, city of Kingston escrow account.
So I think that's, and we know we have the KLDC, that's a quasi-independent financing arm, and that might be a great solution. So I'd be looking to, yeah.
Yeah, and then lastly, it's also really an educational piece as well, just as the moratorium piece is an educational piece. This is also an educational, an ability to educate tenants of their rights in housing court, and that what their rights are under the law.
And the reality of the backlog and the courts being closed, and who knows what will happen in the fall if this pandemic resurfaces. We talk about eviction and court proceedings, but this may be not even, maybe moot, because there's just such a backlog. Who knows when these things will actually be seen? Speak.
Yes, Michelle.
Alderwoman Hirsch, from where we sit and understanding how long things may take intellectually, we may understand that. But for a person in their home who's not received their stimulus check, who's not received their unemployment benefits, and might have a landlord that is not so friendly, that's not an assurance that we can give a tenant in the city of Kingston. That we can't say to them, oh, don't worry about it, it's not going to happen for a while. We need to make sure that we are communicating the law to them and protections, and doing everything possible as their representatives to make sure that they are stably housed. Thank you.
Yes, good. So I think then that's a couple of things that we've definitely got to talk about. So at this point, I'm wondering, Don, do you have any initiatives along these lines that you'd like for us to consider, to throw out there?
Well, I had mentioned last time about the housing siting committee, that I wanted to identify a couple of sites to, what do you think would be the next step on that?
Well, one thing is that's good is I was talking with a member of the Poughkeepsie City Council, and they're thinking along the same lines we were talking about last week, how to find particularly city-owned properties, but other potential sites for building low-income affordable housing, different types of housing that we definitely need, and trying to develop ways to streamline the process for that type of housing, both to deal with the emergency as much as we can in the short term, but to continue dealing with the emergency that we had beforehand. So in terms of those sites, I think the thing would be is if you've got the potential here, if you could talk with the mayor and see or look with through the land bank what sites might be pertinent.
I have several sites in mind, and that's a good idea. I mean, I have spoken to the mayor about it, and so I will continue that conversation and get his perspective on what is practicable. One of the sites is county-owned, and would require Pat Ryan to be involved. So, so I'll be speaking to Steve tomorrow. I'll put that on the agenda, and we'll report back. Because so the first step will be identify the site. All agree that they would be good, and then to look at the site, one or two sites, the best sites, and say, well, what do we have to do to get them ready for a developer to come and see them, survey them, and do a site plan.
Great. Okay. So that's a third thing on our agenda. I have been talking with a number of people concerned with housing in the Hudson River Valley. I've talked with now people at some other municipalities, particularly New Paltz and Poughkeepsie, comparing notes with them. And a number of things that we talked about in those conversations. I'm going to throw out a couple, but I'll send you all the other items that have come up for us to consider further. One is to try to discern which complexes or property owners have the most tenants at risk for eviction due to non-payment resulting from C-19. So, this is another one of those issues of data collection. So this might be something we might be able to work with building safety or some other source to come up with some information along those lines. Let's see. One is to consider some of the protections known as the good cause protections that talk a lot about relationships between tenants and landlords. New Paltz actually has, it's a volunteer group that's made up of 7 residents, 3 of whom are tenants, 3 of whom are landlords, housing providers, and I forgot what the 7th one is, but Alex Walczyk has brought this group to a really nice point down in New Paltz where they're actually doing some really effective things. And so I wonder if we might want to look at doing something like that. Other things here are we have to be ready for a lot of people facing housing insecurity and food insecurity that have not been in this position either ever or for a long time. And so we need to keep reminding people of things like food stamps. There's money available from the federal government to help folks who are eligible to get money for food. So there's quite a number of things that I think that we can work on. And we will talk more about these at our next meeting, which, Don, go ahead, but then we'll need to talk about when we want to meet again.
Okay, so you were going to invite the housing authority person, is that right,
Yeah.
to one of these meetings? Because that's something else I want to discuss. I'd like to know, number one, what's the reality and what are some of the issues they're facing right now in Kingston?
Yeah.
But I'm also interested in if there's any developable areas there where they can grow or enlarge their footprint to allow for more people.
Okay. I'm putting that on the list here. All right. Michelle, how about you? Anything else?
Just thinking that Alderwoman Hirsch here, thinking that at some point when everything synthesizes and we know more about what funds, what agencies are providing access to various funds and relief for food and housing security, that the city of Kingston can create possibly a page on their website, a handout, just as much education as possible for people, the better. So all that we can do to help educate our community.
Mm-hmm. Good. We also want to make it clear to folks listening that we're not just dealing with the issues of tenants. These tend to be more immediate in some ways, but we're also concerned with homeowners, people who live in single-family homes, for example. One of the things we want to look at for homeowners is the possibility of CDBG funds to help them if they're in trouble with mortgage or property taxes, that sort of thing. So we're looking at all the available resources. Unfortunately, we'll be dealing very soon with ways to allocate over $440,000 made available to us by the federal government through the CARES Act in the CDBG, the Community Development Block Grant process. So if folks know of organizations that would be eligible to apply for these funds, they need to get in touch with the city very quickly in order to send in a letter of intent. President Schott?
Yeah, I was just gonna just piggyback on some of that information. So you go to our website, but the deadline has been extended to Wednesday. I have no idea what day. Today is Wednesday, so next week Wednesday. So in a week, but there's a FAQ on the city website to how to fill out that letter of intent, because it is different than our typical funding sources that we get from HUD each year because of the emergency and the expedited timeline of this. So you can find all of that information on the website. Also, talked to the mayor about this the other day, and thinking that maybe the housing committee here would have some ideas on how to spend some of that funding. And if you do, you could take that to the council committee meeting after the mayor gets the letter of intent and gives his recommendation. So the housing committee doesn't necessarily have to write a letter of intent, which Rennie and you and I were talking about that a little bit. I just wanted to let everybody else know.
Great. So May 6th is next Wednesday. And then I believe the Community Development Committee will be meeting on May 26th to make final decisions. Okay, great. Alderwoman Hirsch?
Oh, no, I just was going to reiterate the date that I had found it, that it was.
Okay. Alderman Tollerman?
Yeah, so Kevin O'Connor's, suggestion about using that money for rental assistance, I think, makes sense. So I don't know if we need to, submit any suggestions after this meeting, or if that just, who does that?
Well, I think what we would want to do is get in touch with RUPCO and find out what I'm sure they're applying, but it would be good to touch base with them and make absolutely sure.
Okay. And does anyone have an update about the land bank? Because I know that they were going through some restructuring to get, make some more progress. Does anyone have an update up there to share?
I don't. President Schott, anything?
No, I don't.
I mean, this is part of the issue is I believe that the position is open, and that's why the mayor wants to hire a director of housing initiatives, because that person would be in charge of the land bank, and then I think would be able to, finish the process
Right.
of transferring the properties to the land bank and getting those going. But I think that's absolutely essential, is to get that moving forward. Oh, and there's Kevin O'Connor. We had a question for you, Kevin. I don't know if you heard, but it was about whether RUPCO is applying for any of the CARES Act funding that the city received.
Yes, so our understanding is that the letter and the application is due this Friday, and we are intending to submit an application. Kathy Germain has been working on it to do rental assistance, and we're certainly very mindful that there may be some competing needs, and we want to put a model in that could be used at varying levels depending on the other needs. But we're going to do that, and so the city will receive an application from us this Friday.
Wonderful. All right. So if there are no other comments then along these lines, we had talked about trying to meet on a bi-monthly basis, which I think, doesn't that mean twice a month, every 2 weeks?
So that's semi-monthly.
Okay, every 2 weeks and whatever that is. I was thinking in trying to figure that out, Thursday nights can be good because we generally don't have any common council related meetings on Thursdays, or we could just plan it for Monday or Tuesday. Just it would have to be the second Monday or Tuesday of the month, so we don't get into conflict with the caucus or common council meetings at the beginning of the month. Any feelings?
So Thursday? It's good.
Well, it could be a Monday. It can't be Wednesdays because we have so many common council meetings on Wednesdays, and it can't be Fridays because Michelle's party schedule won't allow that. Just a little joke. So,
All right, you.
So, Monday, Tuesday, or Thursday, as far as I'm concerned, any of those are fine. It's just we'd have to be careful that we don't conflict with caucus or common council meetings at the beginning of the month.
Okay.
I'm
Yes,
good
Michelle.
with I'm good with Thursdays, so.
Thursdays, Don?
Yep. 6 o'clock, would that be okay?
Is everybody else okay with 6 o'clock? Yep. Okay. So it looks like the next meeting would be Thursday, May 14th. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. So Thursday, May 14th, and then Thursday, May 28th.
Okay.
And so if people have agenda items for that next meeting, if you would get them to me within the next week, I would appreciate it, so we can be sure to have an agenda ready before a week in advance of the next meeting. And I will note too that we're an information committee, so we can always put things on if something new comes up. We don't have to follow the exact strictures of the Common Council committee, full committees, or the Common Council itself. Michelle Hirsch?
So I just wanted to get clarification about amending the legislation that I put in to go to laws and rules for Monday. Is that then something we'll hear back tomorrow, or what is that? How is that being left?
Why don't we, I think we need to talk with President Schott and Chairman Morrell. So maybe we can, the four of us can hang around afterwards here, unless, I mean, Don, you can stay too, but just to figure out what exactly we need to do if we're going to do something before caucus. Is that okay with folks?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
So we'll say then that this meeting of the Housing Subcommittee is officially over. People can stay. We're not doing anything secret, just working this out. So let's see here. So I think the first question is whether whether this has to proceed as an amendment, or whether just put the legislation forward. President Shaw, go ahead, Michelle.
So my understanding is that what I put in can be amended, and that we would do that with Corporation Counsel.
Yeah, I guess we can, well, I'm not sure. Can we, is it okay to proceed on those specific lines? I'm asking President Schott, Chairman Morrell.
Yes, Jeffrey here. That was my question, because it seems like if we're amending the landlord registration, I don't know how we can tie that into because what the legislation that's on the table now is on the agenda now is regarding the moratorium on evictions. So I don't know how we can amend. As opposed to sending a new communication.
I believe Corporation Counsel Dan Gartenstein is here with us. I am. So do you have advice for which direction to go, just to have a special Common Council meeting and introduce this?
Okay. Yeah, I think you should have a special council meeting, a special laws and rules meeting before caucus, where Michelle clarifies that the memorializing resolution which she had put forward is still being proposed, that the extending the moratorium through legislation by the city is being withdrawn from her proposal, and that being added to her proposal and or a separate piece of legislation is being proposed to amend the landlord registration to require landlords to clarify whether they meet the criteria under the federal law. Now, whether you want to do that as one piece of legislation with multiple parts and consider this an amendment as in adding a part, or whether you want to do it as a separate piece of legislation, makes absolutely no difference.
Okay. Chairman Morrell?
It just seems to me like it would be cleaner to have it as a separate piece of legislation. I think we could still add that as a late communication if President Schott agrees.
Yeah, this is Andrea Schott. Yeah, people are still here. So it's kind of, this committee was designed really for research, as Alderman Scott Childress has mentioned a couple of times. So I think, you know, you did your due diligence and brought research on this, and you opened the door, or the door was open to see that you could do something different. So I think this is a perfect example of why we have this special committee, and it's something that we could actually move forward with. But I agree with Jeffrey that this should be another legislation. Keep it cleaner, keep it separate. And then we could talk about it at the special laws and rules meeting on Monday, if that works.
So Michelle, would you be willing to write up the specific piece of legislation and get that out so that you could introduce that then? Or, well, it would have to be somebody who's on laws and rules. But if you could, you know, write it up and you could take the ball, as it were, and explain it at laws and rules.
Sure, well, in conjunction with Corporation Counsel, obviously, yes.
Sure. I mean, however you need to do it. I'm just asking, you know, I mean, I can write it up. Somebody else can write it up. But if you want to do it, I'm just
I
saying.
have some stuff started, but obviously it has to be legally binding for the city, so.
Right,
Yes, Michelle, I will be available to assist in writing it.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you.
My other question on that is if somebody's going to be talking to building safety in the next day, because, you know, we're putting this in as an emergency communication, late communication, and we want to make sure if we're doing this because it's timely and we all agree on that, and this is an emergency, but we want to make sure that this is going to be doable. So is somebody going to be following up with building safety?
Already done.
Corporation Counsel has done it already.
What was that?
Already
Corporation
done.
Counsel,
All right.
it's already done. Dan
Alright.
Garten's
All
All right. Thank you.
So that means it's just a question of, you know, getting the actual piece of legislation to consider, and then so President Schott, can you set up that meeting for Monday before caucus? Talk with Clerk Tinty and make all the necessary arrangements.
Sure. Jeffrey, are you okay with 6 p.m. on Monday?
Yes, that sounds good.
All right. So I will actually tonight send Clerk Tinty a note saying that we're going to do it. Hopefully she'll be able to put it up tomorrow, and then I'll schedule the meeting through GoToMeeting tonight or tomorrow morning.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for.
All right. So
I'm sorry, one last thing just about the other meetings. I've been following a pattern just to keep it all clear for myself. Scheduling, I think I'm up to now 10 meetings a month. I do it a week before. So if you don't get the invite for the special housing meeting tomorrow, it will happen a week before each meeting, where you get the email. But Rennie, do you want to let Elisa know tomorrow that they're happening so she gets them on the website, or do you want me to do that?
I can do that. I'll send her something right now.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Okay. Anything else from anyone? Okay, well, thank you all for the work you're putting in. Michelle, thank you for doing all that research and finding out some really important information for us, and for carrying this forward in terms of the specific legislation we'll be looking at on Monday. Then, of course, anybody who's listening, anybody knows anybody, we're looking for ideas, strategies, tactics, anything to try to prepare for what's coming and then to deal with what actually comes. With that, I will say good night.
Good night.
And see you all soon.
Ciao. Good night. Thank you all.
Good night.
Good night.